Well, hello everyone, and thank you very, very much for the kind introduction, Bruno. And I want to start by thanking the two organizers, Bruno and CK. They have been wonderful to work with, and I'm very, very excited to be having this conversation with all of you. I see a lot of familiar names whose articles I have read and whose name I have come across. So just a universal hi to everyone. And since we are a relatively smaller group, and I was hoping to keep this rather informal, but I will also be mindful of time just to have this real conversation with you, because I'm sure I have much to learn from all of you as I have a very little to share as well. So before we get started, let me just make sure I am sharing my screen and sure everything works. So please let me know if you are not seeing what you're supposed to be seeing. But if there's no objection, I take it. I see a thumbs up from Bruno. Thank you. I take it as the permission to go ahead. So this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart, in that I see this as the intersection of my research as well as my teaching career. So I thought I'll start by having you indulging in me talking about myself a little bit. As Bruno mentioned, my primary research area lies in Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly in women, gender, and sexuality. In Tibetan Buddhism, I dabble in textual studies as well as ethnography. So I'm that kind of person who wants to do a little bit of everything. And my teaching context largely lies in teaching in undergraduate education. And I regularly teach a seminar, which I will introduce in a little bit more detail later, called Buddhism, Gender, and Sexuality, which will form largely the basis of today's conversation. But I also regularly teach classes on Introduction to Buddhism, or Asian religions, or thematic courses on translating religion, which I touch a lot on issues of gender, sexuality, but also in the Buddhist context as well. I'm very honored to be the second presenter here right after a brilliant talk on why and how we should teach Buddhist studies. And in my opinion, to think with Buddhist theories and theorists is exactly one of the reasons, and perhaps one of the more important reasons, I think we should teach Buddhist studies. And I hope I make a small case for that today. I think women and gender studies is an area that really is responding to the issues that are resonating with the students worldwide, not just in North America. And I know we have an international audience here. And it is also part of the intellectual conversation that really defines our time and our intellectual thinking collectively. And for me, I think there's three reasons that Buddhism, or the area of Buddhist studies, could contribute to this conversation. Let me advance here. Is it working? Yes, cool. So I think we all, as Buddhist studies scholars, have our own reasons on why Buddhism is important and why Buddhist studies is worth learning about and worth pursuing. But here, for me, there are three particular reasons that I can think of that we should be teaching women, gender, and sexuality using Buddhist theories and using Buddhist theorists. So the first one is that there is a distinct Buddhist theory of gender and personhood that come out of a pre-modern South Asian context and defines the notions that we discussed today, including sexuality, gender, personhood, and body in very decidedly different ways. And I'm having in my mind particularly a liberal progressive feminist perspective. And the second is that Buddhism has a long history across multiple continents and across multiple cultures and linguistic partners. So the historical conversation partners Buddhism had, I think, is a great introduction for students in college age to the complexities of human expressions and differences. And third, this is also staying true to the goal of a liberal arts education. I find the true truth doctrine or true truth teaching in Buddhism presents a particular way of thinking about gender or thinking about any complex issue that could be productive to the current conversation about identity politics, racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and so on and so forth, and the limitation of that conversation. And I just also like to point out that we can also be thinking about the Buddhist theory of language, among many other things, and there might be many other productive venues that could inspire pedagogical innovation. I should also say a little bit more about what I mean by Buddhist theories and theorists. For me, theory goes beyond textual studies and include embodied everyday practice that becomes a deliberate expression of or a discourse on gender and sexuality. And this is inspired by Nirmana Salgado's critical work in Sri Lanka, interrogating the renunciant everyday of Sri Lankan nouns. And for me, what I mean by theorist, by extension of this definition of theory, are not just Buddhist writers and commentators, in the words of my students, the Buddhist male monastics or those monks. So I'm interested in Buddhist nouns, I'm interested in Buddhist thinkers who express themselves in verbal as well as nonverbal ways. I'm also interested in teaching with, that is, to not teaching about, to not just delivering packages of knowledge or reading materials and letting it remain unchallenged, but to ask about the dialectics of such material, how this knowledge was formed, how they were interpreted, how they were negotiated during a time when this kind of knowledge and theory were produced, but also what this kind of Buddhist theories and theorists, what their knowledge and their discourse on gender and sexuality could do for us. And I should also mention that this is also inspired by Amy Paris Langenberg and her research on the birth in Buddhism, as well as her many other more recent research on the Pali Canon as well. And I'd like to say a little bit more about the layout of the talk. As you can see here, I'm trying to make 3 arguments on why I think Buddhist theories and theorists could be useful for a conversation on women and gender and sexuality studies. So I will give 3 examples from my own teaching materials to discuss the insight we can gather from the teachings with Buddhist theories and theorists. I'll try to keep it on the shorter end. My goal is to be done by 12:40, so we really have more time for conversation. But if you have any additional questions, I should be happy to answer them as well. So before I get started, I want to introduce a little bit more about the seminar I will use for example. So this is an upper level undergraduate seminar I teach in Cleveland, Ohio, so in the North American higher education context. So it's an upper level undergraduate seminar. Usually people will take it from multiple different perspectives. It is listed as a religious studies course, but also usually cross-listed in the institutions that I have taught as a WGST, usually Women and Gender Studies course, or sometimes as a queer studies course as well. So there will be students who are interested in religious studies, but also in women gender studies or queer studies as well. And in teaching this course across 3 different institutions at the University of Virginia, at Denison University, and currently at Case Western Reserve University, I find that there are commonly 2 expectations that are held by students when they enter a class called Buddhism, Gender, and Sexuality. One is that Buddhism is the good religion, meaning that it is relatively unencumbered by a lot of the scandals and a lot of the institutional abuses of power that we see being reported widely on English language media. Relatively, there is an impression of Buddhism as mostly dealing with individual, personal, spiritual development. Buddhism as largely again, singular practice And it is largely also free from a lot of the negative portrayals of religion we see in the media. So that is one of the expectations I think students sometimes have entering this class. And another expectation, and usually this is something goes unsaid, but it really needs to be teased out in the process of teaching about gender and sexuality, is that students also often usually enter the class thinking that there is only one way to think about gender and sexuality, to say that there's likely a very limited understanding of what makes a human being, what are the different ranges of gender, and how sexuality is defined. Not only it is geographically specific, it is usually also very historical. So those are also two of the views I try to tease out during the course of the semester. And my solution to answering this question is to adopt what I call the middle way. One is to say that to reveal the complexity of discourses and practices regarding gender and sexuality in Buddhism. Not to say that all of Buddhist discourses and practices on gender and sexuality is good. Some of them are very inspiring, while others are discriminating and sometimes despicable. So I will get into that a little bit later. And also to encourage students, which is another goal of me to teach this class, to explore the different possibilities of thinking about gender and sexuality, not just from a contemporary perspective, situated in North America, but also trying to think about what does it mean to be a man, a woman, someone of a third gender, as we see commonly defined in South Asia, and 2,500 years from the time that we lived in. So in the following discussion, I hope to give you 3 examples of how I teach this course and what kind of Buddhist theory and theorists I engage with. And I look forward to hearing what you think about this. So forgive me, I just have to put a GIF on there, and I will explain this, why this actually have pedagogical value. So example I would like to use to make my first point is the teaching about karma and its implications on the Buddhist theory of gender and body. Usually in my first 1 or 2 weeks of teaching any class related to Buddhism, I will show the students a short YouTube video clip of the comedian duo Key and Peele and their sketch called The Party Don't Stop. So it is about a pair of 2 friends entering into a party, and they were enjoying themselves at first, but then very quickly realized the party does not stop after the sun comes out, after the next day, and even when they ask for help, even when they kill themselves. I think it is really a shocking realization, but also vivid depiction of the Buddhist theory of karma, which I think requires very much a radical rethinking of many of the lived realities our student living. So I used the Key and Peele sketch called The Party Don't Stop to really bring it home the idea that in the Buddhist world, we inhabit multiple lives. And karma is the force that propels us forward. And one important aspect of karma, so as I don't make you dizzy, I'll move on to a more static image, is the idea that karma is something that propels our future destiny, and it's also something that have decided our current one. I'm sure most of you have heard of the commonly held belief, starting with the South Asian tradition, but gradually migrates as Buddhism moves across the pre-modern Asian world, that women are born as women because they have inferior karma. So the female body is actually a site for inferior karmic display, and by extension, inferior actions in one's previous lives. Usually at this point, I will get a reaction out of the students. They will think, is this a misogynistic interpretation? Do Buddhists think women are inferior in that way? And for me, this is actually a site where we can get into more of the detailed or nuanced interpretation of the Buddhist teaching on karma. And for me, there are at least two different implications I try to draw with the students. The first is that karma is not really just a virtue display that you can sense, you can feel, but you cannot see, but rather for the Buddhist, the body, that is a very visible expression of ourselves, is a site of display of previous merit. This emanates in the description that women have inferior bodies and women have inferior karma, and therefore they're born into this visible body of a female. It is also manifested in the discussion of the Buddha having a perfect body, not just perfect in terms of virtue, but imperfect in terms of male attractiveness, which is discussed extensively in John Power's Abode of a Man, which is a fascinating study that really opens a field of Buddhist masculinity studies. So this brings home the important point of where do we see human virtue manifest, and in what ways does it manifest? But also introduces a second implication of karma, is that there is, in Buddhist theory, as one might interpret, an incidental nature of gender identity. Two of the questions I encourage the students to ask, as you can see here on the slides, one is that, what does it mean to be in one gender in this time, and likely a different one the next life? And the other one, as you can see demonstrated by the Bhava chakra or the Sibek corridor in Tibetan, so the wheel of becoming, is that not only does human beings have different gender, in the Buddhist imagination, you also have gods inhabiting different gender, demons, hungry ghosts, hell beings, animals, and non-human beings. And many of those beings, especially in the divine realm, doesn't even have real embodied human form, real embodied physical forms. So what does that mean to have all different types of beings, some of them imaginable, some of them a little bit harder to imagine, inhabiting certain genders? So that really opens up the question of not just dismissing the Buddhist statement to say that women are born as women because they have inferior karma, but to open up a more productive conversation of to say, where does virtue stand on our body in visible and invisible ways, but also to think about different interpretation of gender as something you happen to have in this lifetime, but can be changed, as is many other conditioned nature of a lifetime, into a different lifetime. And so this is a theory. And a side note on Theorists is that I also usually share an anecdote with my students during my own field research. So I do a lot of ethnographical research in Eastern Tibet with a group of Tibetan Buddhist nuns who are highly educated, who are teachers, administrators, and publishers themselves. And usually at the end of the interview, I will ask this question because I thought it almost always elicit a very interesting response. I will ask them, if you have your next life, would you like to be born as a man or a woman? And I usually pause here and have the student guess, what would they say? Sometimes they'll say maybe women, because they're a woman this lifetime, they're having a good time. Some of them say that maybe they want to be born as a god. And then whenever I ask and answer this question, they almost always invariably will say, I would like to be reborn as a man. And this really challenges our way, I think, in a very concrete manner to think about gender as something that's immutable in our lifetime and something that has inherent value. And I think it offers a refreshing way of imagining gender being something that is incidental and only tied to one lifetime, but can be changed by personal effort and by spiritual advancement. And that added a very different way of interpreting gender in the Buddhist context. So that is the first point I'd like to make. And the second point, let me advance it here, is, I'm sure all of us are aware of, is one of the thornier issues in contemporary Buddhist communities, but also in Buddhist history and Buddhist textual history as well, is something called the 8 heavy rules. And I find the eight heavy rules paired with a close reading exercise becomes a really fruitful venue for discussing the complexity in Buddhist history. And it's a really productive exercise in thinking with complex materials as well. So I'll briefly go over the eight heavy rules and roughly its historical context. But I would really like to introduce some of the more nuanced aspects when I teach the eight heavy rules. So the eight heavy rules, called in Garudama or in Tibetan Jichugye, is the set of rules within the bhikkhuni vinaya, that is the precepts or the disciplines of conduct for fully ordained nuns. And it is said to be first introduced when the Buddha's foster mother, Mahapajapati, requested to renounce and to join the Sangha. The Buddha initially refused, saying that, well, this is not something a woman or you should be thinking about. She asked second time, a third time, and he said no. And it is only at the intervention of the Buddha's most intimate disciple, Ananda, who spoke up on Mahapajapati's behalf, that he accepted women's potential for enlightenment, but then decided to add on the eight heavy rules as the condition for Mahapajapati's ordination. So this has later commonly been interpreted as the additional condition for women to become a nun and for fully ordained nuns to observe. And as you can see here, as a refresher, I'm putting this from the Pali text in the English translation. A lot of the content of those eight heavy rules have to do with the bhikkhuni or the fully ordained nun having to be respectful to male Sangha members, even if she exceeds them in terms of seniority. And there is also another aspect of the supervision of the female monastic community by the male monastic community and not vice versa. So in that sense, there are a lot of interpretations of the eight heavy rules arguing that, I'll advance one more here, that this rule subject the female monastic community to the male monastic communities, and therefore another proof of Buddhism's unfavorable attitude towards women. So the argument I would like to make here is to not say that these eight heavy rules are actually quite liberating for women. I think that is not the case. But I would like to say that just to say that the eight heavy rules are discrimination is a less interesting conversation than the close reading exercise I like to introduce here. So I have put in here the primary source, a very short section from the Vinaya Pitaka, translated by Horner a long time ago, so you can freely find it online, that is used in my class exercise. The way I will teach it is usually for the first class period, I will introduce the rules as I just did and the association of women's ordination. And I will have the student read the eight heavy rules in detail, think about the implications and why Buddha imposed these rules. Then moving on to the second class session on this content, I will have the student conduct the close reading exercise of the primary source mentioned here, and highlighting a few interesting details that might offer a slightly different interpretation of the text. So I will just try to quickly go over that, and happy to discuss in more detail what those where those textual resources are. So one is that when Mahapajapati asked the Buddha to become ordained, the Buddha did not say no, but only replied in its original translation, "Be careful." So Mahapajapati asked, "Oh Lord, wouldn't it be nice if women could also go forth into the life of homelessness?" The Buddha did not say no, but rather said, "Be careful about this thing that you asked." She asked a second time. She asked a third time. Again, the Buddha did not say no, but rather say that, "Be careful." So what does that mean? And this is, again, an interesting detail I asked the student to think about. And the second detail is that immediately after being rejected by the Buddha, Mahapajapati basically ordained herself. And this is my reading here. The text has it, she shaved her head, she started donning the monastic colored robe and followed the Buddha around. Despite not having receiving permission from the Buddha to go forth into homelessness, she basically decided to embody the identity of someone who is an ordained monastic. And the third interesting detail is that Ananda, who is the Buddha, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, saw Mahaprajapati, again, in the garb of a monastic, crying and following Buddha around, traveling with also a group of Shakya women, again, a group of aristocratic women at in the Buddha's clan. And he decided to intervene on her behalf. He interestingly, and this is argued in the secondary literature here by Reiko Onuma in her article, Debt to the Mother, that Ananda actually made two arguments to argue for women's ordination in Buddhism. The first is that women do have the potential to become enlightened should they go forth into the life of monasticism. So he asked the question to the Buddha, not really asking for directly ordaining Mahaprajapati, but to say that if women were to go forth, would they achieve the fruit of arhathood? And the Buddha said yes. But then compounded with another argument Ananda made is that didn't Mahaprajapati took care of you in the duties of a mother when you were little? Didn't she do you this big favor? And shouldn't you in some ways repay this favor? And the Buddha, that is where the Buddha acquiesced and said, yes, I guess we can let women go forth and become ordained. So this is, again, a point of discussion for the students is there seems to be a logical argument of women's capacity to become enlightened, but also an emotional argument or relational argument of Mahaprajapati's special relationship to the Buddha. And what should we make of that argument as well? And another interesting detail, and this again has to do with the lived interpretation of Buddhist teachings, is that a lot of contemporary theorists will actually interpret one tiny detail in the Pali text to say that the Buddha actually requested the 8 heavy rules to be a condition for ordination, but only specifically referring to Mahaprajapati. And therefore, there have been arguments pushing back to say that, well, maybe there is only conditions for Mahaprajapati, but not for all Buddhist nuns that come after her. And so these are just examples of some interesting details, and I have put in 2 secondary literature here that deals with this specific question that I like to highlight when I'm teaching this primary source and to have also the student to discuss. I think this is, again, a very good lesson on the complexity of reading Buddhist text, in that it highlights a lot of the more challenging aspect when we actually get into the nuanced understanding of Buddhist teachings and their implementations. It is a problem of textual transmission. The story of Mahaprajapati comes up in the Vinaya Pitaka, not just in the text that I cited, but in many other places as well. There's a problem of interpretation, meaning that there are different ways of interpreting the text. Could the 8 heavy rules be just conditions for Mahaprajapati? Could it be that it is for all Buddhist women? And who is actually claiming authority on the interpretation of this text? And then also, as Nirmana Salgado's ethnographical work highlights, there's the discrepancy between theory and practice, that is, between the Buddhist teaching of these 8 heavy rules and how community precepts or how the lived everyday life of Sri Lankan nuns is perceived. Salgado highlights that many of the Sri Lankan nuns she talked with claim knowledge of those 8 heavy rules, but does not actually practice it. Or sometimes they will claim that the 8 heavy rules are important, but when pressed, do not actually know what they entail. It is also a good lesson on viewing Buddhism as a historical product, again, going back to thinking about religion in a historical way and not an unchanging tradition. And needless to say, for those of us who are more textually oriented, it is also a really good practice of close reading. And this is the second point I wish to make, to think about close reading as a way of teaching about complex topics. And I'd like to move on to the third one, which is something that is really more pervasive in the way that I teach classes, not just on Buddhism, gender, and sexuality, but on Buddhism as well. So I usually highlight the Two Truths doctrine as a way that is central to the Buddhist way of thinking, of inhabiting complexities and contradictions at the same time. But also, I think it's a useful heuristic device for students to also think about the issues of their time. So the Two Truths doctrine, for me, particularly emphasizes on the simultaneous existence of the ultimate and the conventional truth. One of the common contemporary metaphors to explain the Two Truths doctrine, as you can see on the image here, is the two sides of the same coin. That is, one cannot exist without the other. And I think the implication for the students to think about the coexistence or the interdependence of ultimate conventional truth, and they can inhabit and they can become metaphors for many different ways, issues of our time, is to avail themselves a way of thinking that embraces complexity. That is, usually there's more than one truth at the same time, and contradictions. That is, two things that are saying what seems like to be the opposite can both make sense at the same time. So this is a way of thinking, or this is a way of analyzing difficult concept I try to use throughout the semester. One of the examples, let me advance here, is this Lions World article I use later in the semester in the Buddhism, Gender, and Sexuality seminar. This article is titled, "Does My Transgender Identity Conflict with Buddhism's Teaching on No Self?" So here there is a question, I hope you will be able to read it, it's not too small, by someone who is transitioning their gender identity. The question says, "I was born male, but after many years of confusion, I've come to the conclusion that I'm actually a transgender woman and am now seeking sex reassignment surgery. As a Buddhist, I feel conflicted by the teaching on no self and this unshakable feeling that there is a deep hidden truth about me that I need to express. Am I wrong to embrace this sense of true self?" So there is a much longer answer. As you can see, I have linked the article here by 3 different Buddhist teachers. I just like to read you 2 excerpts in those 2 responses and to highlight how the Two Truths doctrine is operative in this teaching on no self. So one of the answers says, "The emptiness of the self is part of what we face in practice. It is this very emptiness that allows us to work with our karma, clarify our lives, and awaken to the truth. But becoming your most authentic self is part of it too. The Buddha advised his followers to be indifferent to their bodies, but he also taught people to use their bodies as tools of awakening. The Buddha's own story teaches us that extremes are not conducive to real understanding. It does us no good to be miserable, unhealthy, or at war with ourselves." So here there is the embracing of a conventional truth, that is living your authentic identity or living in a way that you feel is true to yourselves in this conventional world, and the ultimate truth of contemplating the emptiness nature of the self. And another response goes, "The teaching of anatta, that is non-self, does not say there is no self. That is, it doesn't say the self does not exist. He states that nothing conditional can be pointed to as being who or what you are. Given that no aspect of being can be identified within any kind of continuous independent sense, to me, teachings of compassion and loving kindness can be your North Star." So again, here you see a combining of the conventional truth, that is to have compassion and loving kindness manifest in gender affirmative care, and the ultimate truth of examining the empty nature of the self, but not the non-existence of the self. And I like to also briefly offer a few other examples where I invoke the Two Truths teaching. One example is a common question students ask is, what does enlightenment feel like? What is the Buddhist life? Is nirvana absolutely something elsewhere and completely detached from the world? And I think the Chu system offers a corrective to that kind of thinking, to think Buddhism is something that is teaching total detachment from this world and is a totally pessimistic teaching, but rather to emphasize that Buddhist teachings emphasize to live in this world in this conventional way, but also to contemplate on the ultimate. And it's also a reminder of the dialectics in our everyday use of language. One common hotly debated topic in the past couple of years is the use of pronouns. So students will also commonly ask, if everything is empty, if we are to not to see language and referring to nothing of substance, why should we use correct pronouns to refer to people? And this is a good opportunity to again remind them of thinking about the Chu system, to think that, yes, to think of language as referring to something that is stable, unchanging, or autonomous is not the way to go, but also conventional Chus, i.e. the conventional language we use every day, has real consequences in the lived everyday life. So there is a actual conventional benefit that we should embrace at the same time of using the correct pronouns or using the correct way to address people. So those are some of the examples, again, going back to my three arguments to say that Buddhist theories of gender and personhood could prove illuminating for students to think beyond a liberal progressive framework. It is a good lesson to teach Buddhist history for students to deal with complexity. In particular, the Buddhist Two-Truths doctrine for me is a useful framework, not just to solve issues interpreting Buddhist history, but also as a useful way of thinking about actual pragmatic problems in this world. And this is all that I have. And I would like to end on a self-promotion note, is that I am supported by the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning to compile a collection of resources to teach Buddhism, gender, and sexuality. So that will include a lot of the primary source readings that I have. And I will also try to pair that with discussion questions. So it is marked as forthcoming, but if you follow my website or if you keep that in mind, there will be more things being posted in the spring. And if you have any suggestions or comments, please also feel free to reach me at my email address here. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really exciting and thought-provoking presentation. We have now got plenty of time for an open Q&A. If you have questions that have occurred to you throughout the talk, feel free to either write them out in the chat, or if you feel comfortable doing so, indicating you'd like to ask a question. I do see your hand, David, but I'm going to abuse my moderator privileges if that's all right, and just ask something myself, which is, so Jue, you said often students enter your class believing that there's only one way of understanding the human. And I just wanted to ask you, because you emphasize so much the interaction with the students, a very simple question, which is, does it get results? You know, do students leave the class thinking differently in general? And just if you could speak to that in very broad terms.
Thank you, Bruno. That's a good question. And I think sometimes those assumptions goes unsaid in the classroom, and sometimes it is worth bringing it to the fore. For example, if I don't mention it, if I don't show that Key and Peele sketch, most students will take it for granted. They will have only one life. And I think that is something to be worth thinking about, of what does it mean to carry on this lifetime, and either in an embodied way, as we will believe, or either in a metaphorical way to have our karmic residue being carried forward. And I think that is something I hope them will leave the class with. And also to think about gender as a way that we're being conditioned, and not really as something that is permanent and unchanging. I think it's also another way, another takeaway I hope they have. So I have not had experience of student coming to me at the end of the semester saying that I wish to become man in my next life, and I would not know how to respond to that. But hopefully this gives you some answer to that question. But that's a really good one. Yeah.
It does. Thank you so much. David, up to you.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. I have a question which I invite you to take any direction you want, as it's rather broad. It's implicit, of course, with the two truths doctrine that much of language, especially as conventionally engaged, is tropic, is constructed. I have the personal experience of working with Buddhist jhana absorptions through the Visuddhimagga style, very marked and I'll say beautiful synesthetic absorptions that unfold in a set sequence. And following one retreat for about a month, I was waking up at night out of dreamless sleep in the middle of the jhana sequence. The question I have is, again, broad, but Buddhist approaches to what many Western analytic philosophers have a hard time even conceiving, Buddhist approaches to experiences that simply are not linguistic. Some part of me knows how to sleep. Some part of me knows how to do the jhanas in sleep, but it's not in language.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's indeed a broad question. And I think maybe I can respond to this, and I'd be curious to hear all of those who teach in the classroom context of how do you get rid of the textbook? How do you get rid of books? Because I think there is a embodied aspect of the Buddhist tradition. Like you said, it goes beyond any verbal expression or even human linguistic or analytical comprehension. And if you were to teach Buddhism in a as comprehensive manner as possible, how do you bring about that experience, that training into the classroom? So I sometimes will have sitting sessions for a couple minutes at the beginning of the class. And in the spring semester, I'm contemplating, really plotting, forcing my students to go to the Cleveland Museum of Art and sit in front of one painting for an hour. I will report back on how that goes. But I think there is for me, a frustrating lack of nonverbal materials being introduced in the college classroom. And I think the Buddhist tradition has a lot to say about it. So I really appreciate that question.
Thanks a lot.
We next have a question from Zach.
Hey, Jue. This is great. I guess I have a follow-up on David's question, which is sort of still on this third point about the two truths. And I guess I'll express it as a kind of worry that maybe is sort of nitpicking, but I'm wondering what you think about it. Like, does this secretly reaffirm the superiority of Mahayana Buddhism over Theravada? I mean, so if we want to say, you know, the way to think about gender is in terms of this central doctrine of this tradition of Buddhism, which claims to be this greater vehicle, then what does it say about sort of, you know, Theravada and sort of like Buddhism before then? What do we say? And I guess I'll just offer like a thought. So I was just teaching Vasubandhu earlier today, and it sort of came up very naturally when we were thinking about like, well, so if like this, if I doesn't refer to an Atman, what does it refer to? And he has this whole kind of account of how it sort of just refers to the aggregates, right? But then one of the students offered like, oh, so it's like a metaphor. It's just like a figure of speech. And I was like, yeah, like that, basically, yeah. I mean, so like the sort of all the self-talk, right? Like that would be one way to think about it. So it's like it has its truth. I mean, so I guess we would want to be careful, right? So there wouldn't be this sort of distinction of truths, but it'd be some like a way of saying that there are different uses of language or something. But anyway, I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Zach. And I I should out Bruno as the residential Theravada expert here. I'd be very, very curious to hear what you think. But for me, yes, this is my bias, right? As someone who's trained in the Tibetan tradition, as that has conditioned my way of thinking and teaching about Buddhism. But I do actually use the Theravada tradition and perhaps in more of their ethnographic study in contemporary Theravada communities. And I find that to be actually a lived response for actually people, how people on the ground deal with gender issues in non-doctrinal ways, to be a useful antidote to that question. But I think I see a few people raise their hand, and I know they're more of an expert on this than I am. So I'm going to be quiet and let Bruno or Nicola respond to that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting, very thought-provoking. So I'm not somebody who works with a lot of text or analyzes text deeply, but more with contemporary nuns. And just to add an example to Salgado's work, which I appreciate very much. Recently, French researcher Amandine Perronnet has done research on Chinese nuns in Wutaishan. I don't remember the name of the nunnery, but a very famous one for their Vinaya rules keeping. And in her article, she describes how these nuns actually argue that the 8 heavy rules, as well as the probationary period of 2 years, and the fact that they have to do the steward ordination, actually elevates them into a more pure way of practicing Buddhism. So they interpret the text totally different than most of the books actually say, when they say it's misogynistic or whatever, right? I think it might be interesting.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much. And yeah, and you see this in the Tibetan context too, right? There are Tibetan nuns where I interviewed, they will say, well, we could become fully ordained by going to the East Asian tradition, to mainland China or to Hong Kong or to Taiwan to become fully ordained. And that is an honorable position to take, as they observe additional rules as a sign of their more prestigious status. So there is a way to kind of in a subversion to interpret additional rules as additional requirements or additional achievements. So thank you so much. That's fascinating to see it in the Chinese tradition too.
I will write in the chat.
We have a question and possibly a defense of the Theravada from MK.
Maybe not quite a defense, but I just wanted to ask about like how you deal with examples. Like I really appreciate the way you are reframing kind of typical arguments or typical examples that are made into arguments that women are put into like subservient positions to men. But how do you deal with examples like in contemporary ethnographic context, where it is the case that because of the embodied female form, women are sort of structurally denied the same kind of access as men?
Yeah, thank you so much, MK. And I am not an expert in the Theravada context, and I'm sure the strategy to negotiate this inferiority is quite different. But I can offer maybe one thing I have been thinking with in one of my research projects is how contemporary Tibetan Buddhist nuns have been renegotiating their gendered inferiority by actually adopting Buddhist teachings. I think one thing quite interesting they have done is to reinterpret the Mahayana, again, sorry, Zach, the Mahayana Buddhist teaching of the mother as the wisdom as a mother of all Buddhas, and trying to emphasize in a liberal progressive framework will be quite backward, if I may use the word, way of saying that essentializing or collapsing women's identity of womanhood as the same with motherhood. which is something I think is not being promoted in, let's say, 21st century America. I think we have that conversation on the separating of motherhood from womanhood a really long time ago. But Tibetan Buddhist nuns are actually saying that women are essentially respectable and important for society because of their identity as mothers. And they actually went a step further, which is a fascinating, I think, appropriation of Buddhist teaching to say that they are actually both embodying compassion, which is based on everyday secular experience of women being able to give birth to children, and the evocation of maternal love that everyone should, goes without saying, understand, but also the same time of the Mahayana trope of women as mothers and as the mothers of Buddha and becoming the embodiment of wisdom. So they're doing this very complex, I think, theological reinterpretation of what it means to be a mother and why that should be equated to a justification of women's status in society, which is one thing I think is quite fascinating to see that being used to negotiate women's inferiority. So they use that to justify women's access to monastic education in monastic institutions. But also when I was interviewing them, they also use the same argument of women are mothers and mothers are respectful to justify actually elevating women's status in secular society. So they use that to argue against domestic violence. They use that to argue against the inferior economic status of women in the households. They also use that to justify why you should give a girl education and so on and so forth. So I guess that's a message of hope, and I'd be very curious to see that in other traditions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to take advantage of a slight lull in questions to offer a very tentative defense of the Theravada, if that's okay, which is, I think the Theravada does not have the advantage, perhaps, of texts like the Vimanicurti Nidesha, which are so explicit in deconstructing gender essentialism. And we also have the influence of Buddhaghosa, who the Venerable Inalio and Alice Collett and others have pointed out seem to really go out of his way to take opportunities to talk about how inferior women were whenever he could slide it in. But I think that there is still within Theravada, particularly Theravada Abhidhamma, resources to think critically about gender essentialism and assumptions of binarism that are still perhaps somewhat under-acknowledged. I mean, scholars like Karunadasa, these great Abhidhamma scholars, sort of are writing in the 70s about there seems to be some conflicts. People, Abhidhammikas within the Theravada, can't really agree on each other about how they're all sort of like, well, of course we know gender is binary and men are better, but they can't quite seem to agree on how and why that works exactly. So that's my partial defense, is that, it's maybe not as bad as we think. Perhaps. MK, please take over.
Well, no, I would just add too that I think what like one piece of what I would volunteer of the defense, and the one thing that I think has emerged in Buddhist studies in relation to the study of women and gender would be also the emphasis or the shift towards attention to vernacular literatures. And in not just like theological reinterpretation, but also in the kinds of shifts that go on when particular terms just start being used in new ways in vernacular literature that we don't typically in genres where we wouldn't necessarily look for theorizing about things like gender. So yeah, I do think that's also like another aspect of what Theravada could do in this case. That's very unclear, but also hopeful.
No, I thank you so much, MK. And I think that's exactly one of my points in trying to say that I think of Buddhist theory and theorists of not just those who have left behind books in writing, right? But those who are living, interpreting, challenging, negotiating this text, but also try to just live a Buddhist life in however you want to interpret that word in their everyday experience. And I think that's equally important in our thinking about what is a Buddhist theory and who is a Buddhist theorist of gender and sexuality, of anything Buddhist. Yeah.
We're coming up now on the end of the hour. And Dr. Liang has very kindly said that she's perhaps happy to stay a little longer if we still have questions for him. But I do want to jump in before people have to go and just say three things, which is this is part of a much broader series on critical pedagogy and Buddhist studies. I really hope that those of you who found this conversation profitable will join us for the next session, which is on the 7th of November, in which Nathan McGovern will be talking about teaching Buddhism together with Islam to combat Orientalist stereotypes. The following week, if you've really enjoyed this conversation, Cornell will be hosting our keynote lecture in Buddhist Studies with Dr. Jingjing Li, who is also on the call with us today, which is wonderful. Dr. Li will be speaking from Cornell's campus, but we will have a hybrid Zoom option, and hopefully you can join us there for that. And then third, and most importantly, before we have to leave, please join me in thanking once again Dr. Liang for her really wonderful talk today and for the wonderful conversation afterwards.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And thank you everyone for providing me with additional resources in the chat. I really appreciate it.